more content here. Good morning. Thrilled so many of you all are joining us today. It's hard to believe that 2023 is right around the corner here, and CMMC and DFAR 7021 will go into final rulemaking in just several short months here later this spring. But with that in mind, of course, just sort of end of the year housekeeping, wanted to provide everybody a very good reminder of what is required now as it relates to NIST 800-171, because some new information out there across the defense industrial base that we'll touch on. Seems like there are a number of companies that are a long ways away. So hopefully share all of that information as well with you. And then again, hopefully time at the end for question and answer. Finding my cursor here. All right. Again, good morning. Elizabeth Niedringhaus, President and CEO of SSE. I'm joined by Charlie today, and I'll give him just a moment to introduce himself. Charlie?
Good morning. My name is Charlie Shudo. I am VP of Technology and Security here at SSE. Been here going on 15 years or so. Two sides of the business. First is the technology side, where I do research and development for new products that go into our technology stack, both security and non-security products. The other side is obviously security hat. I'm responsible for assessments on our side. Those assessments are, gap assessments for CMMC, level 1, level 2, NIST assessments, 800, 171, and 53. Especially with 53, the other part of that security is we have a prime customer, and we manage multiple classified networks for that customer that are geared to NIST 800-53. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you, Charlie. So just as way of background for those of you that are not as familiar with SSE, SSE was actually founded back in 1966 by Susan Elliott. She was determined to get in on the ground floor of the PC back in 1983. Of course, at that time, nobody knew how to use personal computers, so she started a training services business, and as companies looked to roll those PCs out across their enterprises, she began an IT service practice that helped with PC support, into network services, and today has grown into our cybersecurity practice. As Charlie mentioned, we do work directly with the DoD and a prime customer, and have been managing classified data since 2009, and that's really where our cybersecurity expertise began. What allows us to do that successfully is our quality management system. Of course, those processes are the key to compliance, and we are certified to the latest standard 9001-2015. So again, why SSE and NIST and CMMC? It's really the unique combination that we bring to the table working with companies, as we have the cyber expertise and our defense contractor ourselves, but we also have that IT managed service business, commercial practice that's been around 16, 17 years now, that focuses on partnering with small and mid-sized businesses and provides an outsourced IT service offering for them to manage everything from soup to nuts. And so our CMMC and our cyber capability fits right into that. Of course, I'm thrilled to announce that we were one of the first RPOs here in the Midwest, and we have 3 certified CMMC professionals and 2 registered practitioners. Charlie, of course, who's one of those, and we'll be on for the Q&A if anybody has very specific questions. So just going through our agenda for this hour we have together this morning. Again, I really want to hammer home what's required now related to NIST 800-171. Then we'll talk about CMMC 2.0. That's right around the corner here, and all the latest updates from the Cyber AD. help you think about planning for 2023 and the steps you should be thinking about to get to compliance, walk through SSE's solution set, and then we'll wind it up with the risks of non-compliance. And again, hopefully leave time at the end for question and answer. So hot off the press, this actually just hit my inbox this morning. There was a new study done by CyberSheath and Merrill Research of 300 defense contractors. And the data here, while not surprising, is still staggering. So the bottom line, if you look at those bottom two bullets, less than 50% of those surveyed have a NIST 800-171 assessment score and SPRS. This has been a requirement for long enough that, again, that less than 50% is quite shocking. And considering a perfect score is 110, the fact that there's an average score of -23 certainly shows that many, many companies out there have a long way to go to get to compliance. So we wanted to share that. Again, that just hit our inboxes this morning. So launching into exactly what is required for NIST 800-171 and those scored self-assessments in case you're sitting out there and wondering what is required. So again, little bit of background here because people, again, what's so surprising, should not be this far behind the 8 ball when it relates to NIST 800-171. It is not a new requirement. If you look at the timetable here, it actually goes back to 2014 under an executive order under the Obama administration that mandated compliance to NIST 800-171 by 2017. So again, this is not new. And it was in 2019 that the DoD Inspector General came out with a report that said that contractors had not consistently implemented NIST 800-171, which drove the amendment to the DFAR's Clause 7012 that again mandated NIST 800-171 and updated it with 3 DFAR's clauses. This is back in September of 2020, so now well over 2 years ago. It required under 7019 that every defense contractor submit a self-assessment into SPRS, and we'll talk to you about how to do that if you haven't done it. And in 7020, basically provides the right for the government to go in and conduct an audit or a review against the data in SPRS for medium and high security type contracts. It also introduced 7021, so again, well over 2 years ago, that introduced the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, CMMC, which we'll be getting into a little bit further in the presentation. So again, DFAR 7019 and 7020, NIST is required now. There should be no confusion around that. And again, the goal of the interim final rule in September of 2020 was really to increase accountability. Prior to that, the government had no way of knowing where defense contractors stood in terms of implementing NIST 800-171. That's the reason for the self-assessment and the need to enter it into the SPRS database in order for the government to begin to put that accountability into place. So I've talked about the self-assessment. It's an objective self-assessment. Charlie's going to walk you through how to do it, but basically, as I mentioned a little bit ago, it starts with a perfect score of 110, and then based on the defined requirements, you start subtracting for the controls that you don't need. And that bottom line is a score that you must implement into the SPRS database. So let me turn it over to Charlie, who can walk you through a little bit more about getting that self-assessment done.
Okay. And speaking about that self-assessment, so you start with a score of 110. Okay, perfect score since it's 110 controls, but not each control is worth 1 point. So as you find a control that is not completely compliant, and the reason I say completely compliant is as you're going through and doing the self-assessment, the first control may have 6 objectives that have to be met. So in order for you to gain a compliant score, all of those objectives all need to be met. So if all objectives are met for that control, that gives you, you don't have to subtract the score over here on the right-hand side. So there it shows there are 44 controls that are worth 5 points, 14 that are worth 3, and 51 that are worth 1. And then the SSP is an A. Basically, you have to have the SSP or not. If you don't have the SSP, which was mentioned before, you can't submit your SPURS score. So as you're going through doing the assessment, you add and subtract all of these numbers. Okay, you're fine, Elizabeth. Keep going.
Okay, sorry.
And that gives you that final score. So as I just mentioned, if you do not have that SSP, you cannot submit your score in SPURS. Obviously, if you have an SSP, not everybody has a perfect system. You will have at some point in time had some kind of POEM item, plan of action and milestone, where it shows whatever deficiency you had for that control, what you're going to do as far as to resolve that issue and the when. Okay. And as you're going through and submitting that score in the future, we'll get to that section in a second. But that latest date that you have of all of your poems, the one that's going to take you the longest to complete, you want to make sure that date is going to mean something here as you're submitting your SPURS score. On the next page. So what you'll do is you'll need a PIE account. Once you log in, you have to add the SPURS cyber vendor role to be able to access SPURS onto your PIE account. Once you log in, you will select NIST 171 in that section, and there you'll be able to insert in this information. Now, what you're going to need is the date of the assessment, so whenever that assessment was completed, what your score was, so that's that NIST score. The scope of the assessment, you're going to need your CAGE code, okay? That you'll need that from sam.gov. And then the plan of action completion date, that was where I was mentioning that latest date out of all of your poems, the date that you expect you will have a score of 110 to be achieved. And we've got detailed instructions to do all that, to be able to get into SPURS and do all of that. So just let us know if you need that, we can provide that.
All right, awesome, Charlie, thank you.
No problem.
So again, these self-assessments, critically important. We know from our own prime customer and then talking to a number of our customers, the prime customers now today are often saying to their supply chain, companies in their supply chain, if you do not yet have a score in SPURS, we will no longer continue to release purchase contracts to you, because of course they don't want the risk that one of the companies in their supply chain is not compliant and hasn't completed their self-assessment and entered a score into SPURS. So this past summer, DCMA announced that they were going to start sampling some of the information, the self-assessment information that had been submitted into SPURS. What's interesting to note, so this goes to Q2 of this year, so say, June, July timeframe, they noted that 60,000 companies had submitted their self-assessment. We believe that the defense industrial base is somewhere close to 300,000 companies. So again, somewhere around 20% of companies as of just this past summer had completed their SPURS. So not as many, obviously, as required, and of course that the DoD would like to see. What's also very interesting to note is in the sampling of that data, 26% of those 60,000 companies reported a very dubious perfect score of 110. And you'll understand that more on this next slide. So again, the DIBCAC, as part of DCMA, has now began actually completing their medium assessments. So So going in and actually conducting assessments of organizations that had submitted their self-assessment. What's interesting to note, and again, this is what makes that 26% of those companies that implemented, that self-assessed at a perfect score, very interesting, because what you'll note here is, again, those DIB-TAC assessments are showing that for a company that had an average score of 56, and then the average medium assessment score, so meaning the one conducted by DCMA, came up with a negative 57, which represents a 113-point gap. So a huge difference between that score and reality. So again, and we'll get into this at the end of the brief, but a huge risk to organizations in terms of false claims. The knowing or reckless misscoring is setting a company up for a tremendous amount of risk, again, related around false claims, which we'll get into. So again, the third part of that interim final rule that came out in September of 2020 introduced CMMC, the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. So we're shifting now from what's required now with NIST 800-171 into what is coming very quickly around the corner with CMMC. And just to underscore again, NIST 800-171, required now, self-assessment in SPURS, and you need to make sure it's accurate. And as Charlie said, you have an SSP and POAMs for any items where you are not in compliance. Okay, so on to CMMC in 7021. What is the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification? Well, it was put together to build on NIST 800-171 in DFAR 7012. Basically, the DoD went out, looked at what other countries were doing, and added controls and mapped them to various maturity levels, so that the idea was smaller organizations may need to be compliant to a subset of the controls, larger organizations to others. Again, trying to look for cost-effective and affordable solutions for small businesses, and really differentiating on those companies that just had federal contract information versus those companies that really had in their possession controlled unclassified information. The other big piece of this was building in independent third-party organizations that could go in and assess where a defense company stood in terms of meeting their controls. So again, we've got the self-assessment, which builds in some accountability, but this is the ultimate accountability for the DoD with these third-party audits. And again, the graphic on the right really illustrates the paradigm shift the DoD was after, which is on the left side of that graphic, you can see obviously the procurement, trading off cost, schedule, and performance, and the cybersecurity was a requirement in the contract. This really flips it on its head and said, no, cybersecurity is at the foundation of the acquisition process and has to be in place for a company to even compete for contracts. So again, looking at this timeline again, walked you through September of 2020 with the introduction of the 3 new DFARS clauses. In March of 2021, after some internal review of CMMC and 850 public comments, by November of 2021, 7021 was suspended and announced that they were creating CMMC 2.0, which we'll get into and explain to you. Not a huge shift by any stretch, but announcement of CMMC 1.0 shifting to 2.0 and introducing the timeline at that point in time of 9 to 24 months. So rulemaking began just this past summer, July of 2022, and we know it's expected to come out in March as an interim final rule in March of 2023, which we'll touch on in a moment. Okay, so what is the difference between CMMC 1.0 and 2.0? As I mentioned, CMMC 1.0 was largely built on NIST 800 and 171. I think this graphic does a pretty good job of describing the differences, and the first part I'll call your attention to is in the middle of the graphic where it shows CMMC model 1.0 and CMMC model 2.0. You'll notice in 1.0 there were 5 levels. So the DoD reduced the complexity of the model and had it just, is now CMMC 2.0 is just 3 levels. Basically, however, level 2 and level 4 were more administrative levels anyway, so it didn't really change that much. But anyway, CMMC 2.0 is 3 levels. Then I'll call your attention to the far left side of the graphic, and you can see the number of practices that apply to each level. So looking at level 1, 17 practices, you'll note if you look to the right, it's the same 17 practices. The one change was at level 3, there were 130 practices that were going to be required under 1.0. That is back to 110, aligned 100% with NIST 800-171. While the government had, or the DoD had added 20 additional practices that are, again, good practices, and we fully expect down the road will probably get rolled into NIST 800-171. I think the thinking was, why complicate it? Why come up with a new standard? Let's just align with NIST. And if something has to evolve and incorporate more practices or controls, let's let that be NIST. Then the last piece of it I'll call your attention to in the shift in the model, if you look on the left, is the assessment. So again, as I mentioned to you, the whole idea was to build 100% accountability into the model and have third-party auditors complete assessments of all companies, either at level 1 that are in possession of FCI or at level 2 who are in possession of controlled unclassified information. You will note now under CMMC 2.0 that at level 1, the annual self-assessment is the requirement. But the key here is that it requires annual affirmation by a senior company official. Again, think about the False Claims Act violation that I mentioned previously. It's not just submitting a self-assessment score, it's submitting it with a senior company official affirmation. And at level 2, they actually bifurcate that and they say, for most of the contracts, it will require the third-party audit as intended under 1.0. There are some contracts, however, that might not be critical to national defense that would be allowed to have the annual self-assessment. But our understanding is those will be the minority, much fewer, as the majority of the contracts and companies who have CUI will be required to have the third-party audit. Okay, so this next slide again gets into that assessment piece, which is really a huge shift because again, NIST 800-171 has been required since 2014. This isn't that new, but again, getting that audit in place every 3 years with a third party or annual self-assessment with a senior company official affirming the data. So Charlie talked you through the 110 controls and the scoring. I think the piece that a lot of companies get tripped up on and fail to recognize the complexity is that at level 2, while there are 110 controls, there are actually 320 assessment objectives. So when that audit is done, they are actually looking at the assessment objectives within that 110 controls. So the volume there is 3 times in terms of what they're looking at, or we'd be looking at if we came in and did an assessment of your environment. So substantially more there than maybe meets the eye when you think of 110 controls. So just a week ago, the Cyber AB held a town hall. They affirmed they believe and expect the release of 2 interim final rules in March of this year, so just around the corner. That requirement would then show up 60 days after that rule, so May, and that they're considering potentially a 3-year rollout plan is what they understand from the DoD. But a big reminder that on day 1, everyone is required to have done that self-assessment with positive affirmation. They are encouraging companies to early adoption and submit their name for voluntary self-assessments. We'll get into that in a little bit. So there are now 29 approved C3TAOs. Again, those are the third-party certifying organizations. There are 444 companies who've submitted an application to be considered C3PAOs. Again, the voluntary assessments that are being highly encouraged are actually a joint effort between DCMA DIBCAC and C3PAOs. There have been 5 voluntary assessments completed since these began in August. And the real benefit to companies who are willing to go in and do this is that if they pass that assessment, again, they can convert to CMMC, that would convert to a CMMC certification at the time that CMMC is officially implemented. So that's the real advantage to those of you that might be in good shape and looking to be early adopters. So again, just to hammer home the timing on this, because it is not that far away, it's expected in March of 2023, a release of 2 interim final rules related to CMMC 2.0, with those requirements showing up in contracts in May, so just 5 months away. Okay, so here we are. I think this is 2022 planning, but we really mean 2023 planning as we're here almost at the end of 2022. And I'm going to turn it over to Bob for a moment, who's going to walk you through the first 2 steps here, and then I'll pick it up on step 3. Bob, over to you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And no, we do still mean 2022 planning, because it is not too early to get started, especially with this first step.
You're right.
We've got a mix of folks joining us today, some of which are our current clients, and we thank you, some of which we've already engaged with and helped, at least with this first step. This is something we offer as a complimentary service. So if you've been working on things, if you are struggling to understand some of the requirements, the timelines, what's changing, what's going to apply to me, this initial readiness assessment, where we'll just give you a survey that Charlie and his team have mapped to different requirements and allow us to get some information, a sampling of the work you've been doing in your environment. And we can bring you back a high-level overview of where we believe you are in the process. This can be eye-opening to companies that think they're this far ahead, but in reality, based on what we're seeing, we would estimate that they're a little farther behind than they think. We can turn this around in as quick as a week or 2, and it's not going to be the granular gap assessment that we'll get to on the next slide, but this would be a little bit of validation, sort of a gut check, and a good checkup to see where you are. But we would recommend you schedule this now in 2022 and start to get a head start on looking at next year. For those of you that are a little bit farther along, or are really looking at that DoD team timeline and thinking about how best to prepare your company, our gap assessment aligns completely with the measurables and the information that you're going to need to do your NIST 800-171 submission to SPRS. We provide a detailed security assessment report. We call it a SAR. It contains, most critically, information for an SSP. So if you do not have an SSP, if you're one of the 40% of companies mentioned in that initial survey that Elizabeth shared at the onset of this session that does not have an SSP, this will give you the information that you need in order to ensure what you're submitting to the DoD has validity. Furthermore, any controls that are not met, you will have POAMs, plans of action and milestones, describing the deficiency, describing the methodology and what you need to do in order to remediate that. That's going to be critical should you be, or when you will be audited, to be able to show, here's where we are, this is how we need to fix this and reach compliance. And then lastly, Charlie and his team will give you a full NIST 800-171 basic assessment score. So you'll be able to submit that score with confidence to SPRS, knowing that it is validated and backed up on the evidence collected and documented to the controls themselves. So we would recommend scheduling this now for Q1. We have several of these already scheduled out through Q1 and Q2 of next year for companies that are trying to align with the DoD timelines that Elizabeth shared earlier. So digging a little bit deeper, here's some of the information that we will provide you that can be used for an SSP. It is a document that will go control by control, will show the implementation status, and then show the implementation details. And I'm going to hone in on that box because you see the little subset lowercase letters. That's going through each and every objective under that control to be able to ensure evidence was collected for this. This particular example was not met, but if it was one that we showed that was, you would then see details as to where to find that objective evidence within that company's environment. It could be a screenshot, it could be a policy document reference or name, something along those lines that's going to point an auditor as to where this information is to validate that you're meeting that control. Furthermore, the POAMs that I referenced, we deliver this in Excel format, so it's a working document. You can assign them out, you can show progress, you can show status updates, you can modify them as needed, group them, sign them. We've worked with companies that want to attack these domain by domain or control family by control family. We've worked with clients that have said, hey, show us everything that is related to policy documentation, and then let's work together on that versus IT tools will satisfy these. So this is really where we spend a lot of the time doing gap assessments, reviewing this information with companies, and really helping them hone in and fine-tune that roadmap. And then lastly, your basic NIST 800-171 assessment score. As Charlie referenced, you need to have an SSP to submit this. What you will submit is just the score and the date by which you will have a perfect score. We give you more than that. We do go control by control. For reference, you see we've got the CMMC practice number as well as the NIST control number. Would have been nice had they just kept those the same, but it's the government, right? But line by line, so you can see, you can sort by criticality. What were my 5-point deductions? What are the ones? What are the threes? And then again, we'll work with you and your team to go through this and help you put together that roadmap as to how you plan for remediation and reaching and sustaining compliance.
All right.
Back over to you, Elizabeth.
Yeah, great job, Bob. Thank you. And again, if you haven't gotten started and you're one of those folks without an assessment score, it's a great place to get started so you can enter one with confidence. Okay. All right, so remediation. Once you know where you stand, right, then the real work begins to remediate and work off those POAMs. SSE has a solution set that's made up of 3 core pieces. One is our tech stack. That's actually 20 different tools that can be implemented to meet the controls. So think at the most basic level, multi-factor authentication, antivirus. We have 20 group policy objects that, again, can be implemented within your Active Directory environment and, again, help satisfy a number of those controls. And then last but not least, we have templated policies that companies can use to implement their controls. Keep in mind, a big piece of this is having those policies well documented and then being able to verify that you're meeting those policies. I cannot underscore the amount of work associated with the policy development. But between our IT tools, the GPOs, and the policy templates, our goal is to be the easy button to get to compliance. So again, if you think about remediation, customizing and implementing those policies and procedures related to NIST 800-171 and CMMC. Again, the policy work is always more than companies ever think it's gonna be. Charlie could tell you some horror stories and weekly calls with customers that seem to go on forever as companies struggle to find the time. Really, it's not that complex, but it's just really finding the time and carving that out of somebody's regular day to get those policies created. Next is obviously implementing the IT infrastructure. So if there's out-of-date hardware that would be a risk, getting those GPOs implementing, getting the tools that are missing in your environment in place, of course, all related to a defined system boundary, whether that would be on-premise or a cloud hybrid type solution. And of course, then getting in and getting that all installed. The timing on this is a little more complex than what Bob just walked you through, because of course it really depends on the environment of the client we're working with, their starting point. For smaller customers who might not have a lot in place, this could be as much as a 6-month or longer process. For those companies, maybe larger companies that have a lot of it in place, but just need a handful of tools and maybe the GPOs and need to get their policies updated, it could be a 3-month type process. But the deliverable from this, in addition to getting the environment remediated, is a completed system security plan. So again, just to walk you through the pieces of our solution set, again, our tech stack, you can see here, it's made up of three parts. One, just the basic management tools in order to be able to help companies manage these tools in their environment. But then you see the number of tools that satisfy level 1 controls and those that satisfy level 2. If you had none of these IT tools in place, assume none of these existed in your environment, and you started with that perfect 110 score, not having these tools alone would be a 90-point deduction. Then you get to the group policy objects. So here, if you think about just logging into the system, for example, and password protection. So think about password complexity or the number of times you're going to allow an unsuccessful login attempt. Again, all of these related to group policy objects. You can see here the standard set of GPOs we put into a client environment that are fully tested. If you didn't have the IT tools and didn't have the GPOs, you'd have to take a negative 152-point deduction, again, from that 110 perfect score. And last but not least, rounding it out, the policies and procedure templates. Again, I can't underscore the complexity and just really the time to get all of these implemented. If you'll note in that middle column, it shows you the number of client inputs to basically customize them to your environment. There's actually 122 of them across the various families of controls here. And of note, our access control policy is about 50 pages. It is the largest of the domains and is a lot to document. So again, just want to underscore some of the time constraints here related to the policies. So last but not least, once you get that all implemented, of course, things don't always stay in place and work forever. We all know that with IT. So at the very basic level, our managed service offering out of the box meets CMMC level 1. So for smaller businesses that don't have in-house IT staff, or maybe today outsource that to another firm, what you get with SSE is CMMC and a box. So all the network monitoring and administration, the user support, of course, and help desk services, your standard network health reporting, the consulting as a VCIO and a VCISO, as well as project services and workstation build. So again, kind of out of a box, our standard MSP offering meets the CMMC level 1 requirements. For that next level of companies that need to be satisfied level 2, we have cybersecurity as a service that again can be layered on top of our standard Pretecht offering, or these solutions, depending on the size of the organization. Again, if you just need a couple of the tools, you can outsource the management of those tools and the GPOs to SSE. We'll do the continuous monitoring. Again, some things need, depending on those policies, need to be monitored weekly, some things monthly, some things quarterly. We manage all of that monitoring for you. We'll maintain the tools. While we're doing that monitoring, we are very careful to gather the evidence, collect that up, store it on your server, so that when you get that third-party audit, all of the evidence is there that shows your ongoing compliance. If something ends up not working, which happens, we'll build out a POAM item for you, a plan of action with milestones. Of course, we address any critical alerts that come in, and we provide all of the monthly reporting that as an executive I want to see to make sure that we're maintaining our compliance. So with those solutions in mind, Bob, I'll turn it back over to you to walk through some of the clients that we have and how we've helped them.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Yes, we wanted to share a couple of case studies with you, and I won't read you every word on the screen, but the point to be made here is that all of these solutions are customizable, and they require some due diligence and some planning. So you want to make sure you have plenty of time. Company A on the left, smaller organization, manufacturer. They really needed help and needed us to do everything for them. Full IT support, your basic blocking and tackling, firewalls, servers, etc., all the way up to the more sophisticated cybersecurity tools and services needed for CMMC level 2 and ongoing ConMod. Company B, well over 100 employees, has sophisticated internal IT. They only needed help with a specific subset of services and policy work to layer on top of what they were already doing to get them across the finish line. So how that got defined all started with those early readiness and gap assessments, and specifically honing in on what those exact POAMs were, and then working with these companies to figure out how best to remediate them in the most cost-efficient and timely manner possible. So we wanted to share some of our own findings. We shared what the DoD has shared from the sampling they've done, but Charlie and his team have conducted dozens of gap assessments over the past few years, and the average score that we have assessed for NIST 800-171 has been a -79. What's interesting about this is that when those companies had already scored themselves and made a submission, we found on average a 106-point gap versus how they had scored themselves and the true evidence-based score. So again, a significant difference between perception and reality. And just to really hammer home why that's important, and Elizabeth is going to cover some risks on the closing slides, but submissions not done in good faith, or if you put out a date by when you're going to have a perfect score and don't meet that date and win an award or a new purchase order, those could put you at risk to False Claims Act liabilities. So one of the most common questions we get asked is how much time could this take? And really it depends on a company's starting point, but we wanted to give you some rough baselines here. Readiness assessment, couple weeks, gap assessment, figure about a month. Remediation projects could vary, but we can do those concurrently with layering on ongoing support. So ballpark, maybe 3 months up to 6 for a mature IT environment, a little bit longer if there's an extensive remediation project involved for a non-mature IT environment.
All right, awesome. Bob, thank you for covering that. Now, as both Bob and I have alluded to, I want to walk you through the potential risks of non-compliance. So again, by way of background, I really want to point to the language in these DFARS clauses because we believe that it is intentionally written to hold contractors accountable. If you look back to the NIST 800-171 that was required in 2017, and it is noted that contractors represent they will implement NIST 800-171. Then under DFAR 7012, contractors agree they shall implement as soon as practical, but no later than 2017. Under the November 2019 clause, it says, in order to be considered for an award, an offeror must verify a current NIST 800-171 self-scoring of its information system. And again, CMMC 2.0 will require at least affirmation of compliance by a senior company official. Again, setting up the contractor's accountability. So what are the big risks of non-compliance? The big risk is liability, as Bob and I both mentioned, under the False Claims Act. It is a false claim to make a statement material to a contract claim that is known to be false or a reckless disregard of the truth or a deliberate ignorance of the truth. Material statements include statements to induce the award of contracts or contract payments. Again, 7019, we believe, was deliberately crafted to compel contractors' attention to NIST requirements by framing the false claims term. So again, and if I flip back to that 7019, again, in order to be considered for an award, an offeror must verify a current NIST 800-171 self-scoring of its information system to include the SSP and the expected completion date. The knowing or reckless statements about current scoring or planned compliance, we think, is rather obvious. So back in October of 2021, the DOJ announced a new cyber fraud initiative where they were going after companies in the defense industrial base related to cybersecurity related fraud. Didn't take long. In March, there was a almost $1 million settlement by a company out of Cape Canaveral, Florida, who was a medical services contractor. The settlement was based on violations related to falsely representing compliance with contract requirements. And here, obviously, a $9 million settlement for a company out of El Segundo, Florida, Aerojet Rocketdyne. I think what's interesting here to know is that it was a whistleblower that initially brought this to the DOJ. So again, not small, not small fines, and hopefully that sets the stage for companies to really realize how serious this is, making sure you get an accurate score and making sure that you are on top of maintaining your compliance. With that, we'll wrap it up and open it up for Q&A, but we thought it would be helpful to have a set of questions that as business leaders you could ask inside your organization to really get a sense of where you are and where you may need help from outside expertise in order to make sure that you're moving forward and in a compliant state. So asking the question of, do I have a system security plan? Have I submitted a NIST 800-171 self-assessment score? Could you provide support if the DIBCAP came knocking on your door? Would you be able to support your score submission? If you know you're compliant or not compliant, do you know how you're going to get there? And are you, as a senior company official, ready to affirm your compliance to NIST 800-171? If you were me, I would know that I would want a third-party review of the environment to be very sure that what I was signing off on was true and accurate. So with that, we'll open it up to the Q&A. Bob, I'll turn it back to you. Thanks.
Thanks, Elizabeth. We do have a few questions, some of which we answered throughout, but some I think will be good to share with the group. First and foremost, will this recording be available afterwards? Yes, it is. We will be sending it out to all registrants and attendees, so you will have this information. Number two, and Charlie, we had a couple questions on this, so I'm going to turn it over to you. Can you talk about what has been like the most consistent or biggest deficiency that SSE has found conducting gap assessments?
Policy documentation, first and foremost. A lot will go through and I'll say, well, how are you verifying users once they're hired? Oh, well, this is the ticket that we have that gets submitted to IT, and this is where it gets handed off to HR, showing that they go in through their background checks, and this is how we hand off the ticket for IT to create, all of their blah, 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 et cetera, et cetera. Okay, but do you have a process documented that shows how that all works? No. Okay. There's nothing in policy? No. So a lot of customers are doing the actual technical implementations. They actually are, have people that are doing the work that's required, but it isn't documented anywhere. So there's no policy, no procedure. That is the biggest by far.
Thank you, Charlie. On that note, could you talk a little bit about how we have helped companies with that policy documentation moving forward? Because that's you and your team that are doing a lot of that.
Definitely. So we'll usually kick off do a little kickoff call, depending on the engagement. Most companies want us to either just, be available for questions. So if they can go through the policy documentation themselves, and then they have, little, scheduled times to have questions, or it can be hand-holding the whole way through. Usually we'll have a cadence of usually around 3 months max, depending on, how involved we are. And we'll do either weekly or bi-weekly meetings. We'll go through and we'll talk about in those documents that we have as far as the, I'm going to get it out. Can't talk today. As far as the policies are concerned, each section has where there's an input that's required by the customer. It'll give a description of what's required. And I usually go through those things and make sure that there's no questions. And say, this is what that interpretation means. This is what you need to do to fill it out. And then the customer will go back, they'll go through and they'll fill out their documentation. They'll send me updates or send people from my team updates during the time between the next meeting. So in that way there can be follow-up and whatnot. And we just kind of go through those each week, every other week, just depending on cadence. and go through, usually alphabetically. We'll start at access control and just keep going alphabetically through we get to the end. Sometimes there's some skipping around because, for instance, access control and IA, those link together really well. So anyway, that's normal process.
No, thank you, Charlie. Another question that came in, and we literally took this slide out for this session because there was a lot to cover with updates, but are POAMs being allowed with CMMC? Yes, they are, but on a very limited basis. They're going to be strictly time bound. The DoD has said that 180 days would be the max, so 6 months at the very most. And they are also going to be limited in nature. They are not going to be allowed for the most critical elements. So thinking back to those NIST assessments and methodologies, those 5-point deductions that make up about 40% of NIST 800-171 and CMMC Level 2, POAMs will not be allowed at all for them. And then lastly, the DoD has said there will be a minimum score needed by which they will even consider POAMs. So a common misconception has been, oh, we can just transfer all of our NIST POAMs to CMMC. That's not the case. It's going to be much more stringent and regulated.
And just
we got a couple more questions.
Just to add real quick to that, in going through the assessment process, they have stated 80% of CMMC Level 2 will have to be attained for POAMs to be considered. So that means you would have to have a score of 88 or higher to be able to carry POAMs over and not have to resolve all of your open items within 5 days of the of them finishing the assessment.
Thank you, Charlie. Question about, will we also include the slides? Yes, we'll send you those out in PDF version. A lot of this info is publicly available. A lot is specific to our company, but I do see your question. No, we've met before, so yes, we will send you the slides. And then lastly, question on cost. Do we have a baseline cost schedule for the various services and tools we can provide? We do, but truth of the matter is that's customizable by the environment and the situation. Happy to have an individual follow-up conversation to understand how your network environment is configured, how many workstations, how many servers, is it cloud, hybrid, et cetera. And we can definitely show you what those costs would be, both for an assessment as well as projecting that out. And I believe that exhausts the questions, Elizabeth, and we were right up on the top of the hour.
We are, I think I just saw one more pop in.
What does the certification cost? Yes, so I believe you're speaking to the actual CMMC audit.
Yeah.
Charlie, you had shared some info on that on a call we were on yesterday. I don't know if you want to speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, we have relationships with a couple of C3PAOs, one that actually is a C3PAO and the other one that's actually doing their audit this month to become a C3PAO. And I was just kind of curious, what they were looking to charge. One was in the mid 30,000 range. The other one was in the $20,000 range. There's not a set cost. So it's going to be an individual, the nice thing is you can go into the CMMC, the Cyber AB marketplace. You can pick C3PAOs, you can contact them, you can interview them, you can see how they fit for your organization for an assessment, and they will give you that pricing. It is not set by any means, but those are just two examples that I have.
And Charlie, wouldn't you think that's for a fairly basic sort of single domain type environment? Obviously, depending on the complexity of the environment, the number of locations probably increase that cost.
Correct. So, I mean, a lot of smaller organizations just have one location, that's one thing. But I mean, just specific to us, we have data centers in 3 different geographical locations. And CUI is in all of those. So that would mean that an assessor might have to go on site to all 3 of those locations. That would affect the cost.
Right. Exactly. All right. Well, now we truly are at the top of the hour. So anyway, thank you all for hopping on the call today. Hope you found it informative. We would love to answer any specific questions you have. Let me see if I can get the slide turned here. You have Bob's contact information, either his email or his phone. Again, we're here, love to be a resource and love to help you get compliant. So Thank you all. Have a great day. Take
Thank you.
care. Bye-bye.